Welcome to the Agile Wire, where professional Scrum trainers Jeff Boobles and Jeff Molesky discuss Agile topics. Now, here are your hosts, Jeff Boobles and Jeff Molesky.
And we are recording. All right, Mr. Boobles, kick us off, man.
All right, so this week on the podcast, we got Cliff Hazell. He's here to talk to us about flight levels and why we should all care about those. And maybe we're going to get into some systems thinking things. But a little background about Cliff. Cliff was an Agile coach at Spotify, actually a chapter lead, so a leader of Agile coaches for 4.5 years. Recently founded Flight Level Academy with a couple other folks. And has really been helping organizations think more systematically and how to connect different types of Agile inside of their organization together to really start delivering value. So I don't know, Cliff, let's jump into it. Thanks for jumping into the podcast. But
it's a pleasure. Love to be here.
Let's just start with what is a flight level, because some people might not have heard that term before. So
Sure.
Let's just start there.
So flight levels is kind of in response to a lot of organizations doing Agile within the company and often being very focused on the team level. And kind of the metaphor for this is if you think about an organization as lots of different keys on a keyboard, often what we do is we try to kind of optimize how fast each team presses one key that they're specialized for, rather than how do we write letters, which is usually what the customer actually wants. And so what we realized is that in order to be able to do this, you actually need to think about the organization at several different layers or levels. And this is where the metaphor of flight levels comes from. So if you think about it, if you fly close to the ground, sort of a low flight level, you see quite a lot of detail, but not a lot of breadth. You can't sort of see far into the future or anything like that. But if you fly really high, you get to see quite a lot of breadth and you can sort of see the whole lay of the land, but you can't see any detail of any particular team or maybe of any particular project or something along those lines. Of course, the point is not that one is better than the other, but you actually need to kind of combine. And in flight levels, we talk about it as 3 levels. So at the top, usually organizations have a strategy. At the bottom, you have something like operations, where we make stuff and build things. And in the middle, we call it coordination, which is usually connecting the dots between multiple teams or connecting the dots between the strategy and the teams. And so it's both up or vertical kind of coordination and horizontal. So does that answer the question? What is a flight level?
Yeah.
That's the
so some people might be thinking, okay, this sounds a little bit like a Kanban flow or a value stream or something like that at multiple levels. Yeah. And so tell me more, like same principles, right? We're worrying about flow throughout the organization at all levels.
Yes,
is that
very
like
similar.
the main concept?
Yeah, so a lot of the people that we work with actually come from the flight levels or from the Kanban community. Klaus, who is the co-founder along with myself and Katrin, he's been a big person in the Kanban community for a while, written, not read. He has also read some books, but he also wrote a few books, which is, it's nice to give back, I guess, and write something, not just read everything. But yeah, there's this very strong influence from Kanban. There's also a lot of stuff just kind of from Agile in general, although I would say flight levels is not exclusively focused on trying to make the organization agile. That usually is kind of the lens through which people are wanting to make improvements. And so it could be through the lens of digital transformation. It could be being more customer-centric. It could be being more responsive to the market, something along those lines. But you're totally right. It does often look quite similar to putting a sort of a Kanban system at multiple levels. We call it slightly differently because I think there's a lot of stuff in Kanban and also in Scrum that maybe are more than what we need to do flight levels. And some people will use those extra things anyway in their organization, but we don't necessarily find it always as relevant if you're doing sort of a simple flight levels setup within your business. So yeah. Lots of overlap, but also a few key differences.
Quick break. We know you can't support all shows, but when you do support a show, think of the Agile Wire when you subscribe and share. Cliff, as you were talking and really kind of describing those different levels, immediately what came to mind, and I had to go and Google it on my other screen, was SAFe. And so it's been a long time since I've taken a SAFe class, probably like 4 or 5 years now. But it had a very similar type of implementation there. I'm even looking at the picture, right? You've got the 3 levels, kind of different levels of visibility into the organization. So what and I'm making an assumption that you're probably familiar with SAFe to a certain degree, and I'd be kind of curious, like, what's the difference? Like, why not? Hey, I mean, this has got a pretty picture. All I got to do is plug some shit in here, and I'm going to be safe from my organization. Why would, why not go with SAFe versus flight levels?
Yeah, I get this question quite often. People are like, well, we're already doing SAFe. Why would we need flight levels? Or we're considering one or the other. Which one should we pick? I think a lot of it depends on the problem you're trying to solve or the situation you find yourself in. There's two main things where I see people using flight levels in kind of either an alternative or in addition to SAFe. The main one is that often what happens with SAFe is that you find that the organization has many different parts that are all doing something a little bit like SAFe, maybe in slightly different versions or slightly different variations. But what you want to do is start to then connect those parts together. So you have some area that's doing SAFe, some is doing Scrum, some is doing, traditional waterfall, some does something else in procurement or whatever. And so Flight Levels is trying to focus on connecting all of those parts together in a way that is helpful. Not everybody in procurement needs to talk to everybody in finance and everybody in marketing and product development, but some people might from time to time. So let's look at how that works. And the other part is, I think, in a situation where people are saying, well, we're sort of interested in what SAFe is doing. It sounds like it could be a place that we might end up, but we don't want to spend millions of dollars to train the entire organization as the first step. We would rather start and kind of iterate and experiment a little bit. And so we kind of joke a little bit is that like Flight Levels is sort of, I wouldn't say that it's kind of a cheap alternative sort of thing, but it's certainly cheaper than a lot of things that are out there in the market. You can start with one or two teams. You can start with the smallest area of the organization. And what we specifically focus on is trying to get really good kind of results for the focus or change that you make. So don't change all the things to fix a simple problem that's actually maybe just a coordination issue. You don't need to redesign everything, restructure everything, have tons of new roles, whatever. So in that situation, if you feel more comfortable with kind of a, take what you need or kind of buffet sort of style approach, you pick the bits that are relevant. And if you like something, you can get more of it. If you don't need it, then move on to the other thing. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think at least for me, that's kind of part of what it's about. Yeah.
When I think of a spectrum of like how heavy or I don't know how many parts there are to scaling. If you look at like SAFe's on one end, and then you've got other things that are very lean on the other side, I put Flight Levels way on the right. Maybe similar to like Less or Nexus. Like they're trying to take the minimal but sufficient approach to get going and handle whatever coordination you need to do, remove whatever coordination you can remove, whatever makes sense to you. And I think that it's not a very dogmatic approach where sometimes if you go way to the left, like maybe some of the times in the SAFe community, it's like you have to do it because SAFe says to do it this way. And a little bit over here, it's like, let's pick the things that work for us in this community. And there's lots of different practices and principles, right, that you can use.
Yeah. I think that there's another piece to that, which is also that we try to only teach things that we have actually done and that we've found to be useful, rather than saying this is a pattern that you should always use in your company, because I don't think there are silver bullets or one size fits all kind of approach. And I think what I've often seen is a situation where you've got somebody trying to teach somebody something about product management, but they've never been a product manager. I rather say, well, if I haven't done the role, let me rather not teach you from theory. I would rather teach you from practical experience. And so all of the folks who are using Flight Levels and teaching it, they've actually done this, or they are doing it in organizations. It's not kind of coming from a, we dreamed it up sort of, and maybe this could be helpful. We've actually tried it. And so I think that's also can be a bit of a difference sometimes, is that, that just a slightly different approach. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you were talking earlier, you highlighted like what are those things that we're seeking to improve in our organization? I think you had said maybe like coordination costs or coordination across teams, et cetera. I would imagine like one of the first things that you're trying to do is baseline, and as an organization who's attempting to change, like your first thing to do is baseline and understand what your goals are. Like, what are the things that we want to focus on? Are there, so for Flight Levels, is there kind of I don't want to say like out of the box, but like kind of standard goals that typically you're going after? I would imagine there's a focus on getting the right things done quicker. Like understanding what it is, the problems that we're trying to solve for our customers, and typically those are solutions that we're trying to get in front of them, and the speed at which it takes for that solution to move through our system. So kind of like those two core pieces. But is there something else that you recommend starting with, or are there other common things that you find that organizations are trying to pinpoint and improve on?
Sure. So there's kind of two ways to answer this question. So one is like about talking about the goals generally, and the other is about some examples of common goals. I think it's very helpful, and one thing that we spend quite a lot of time, especially if you're doing it inside a company, but even in a public sort of class kind of context, is getting folks to have a conversation about what actually is the goal. Because I've been amazed at how often you get anything more than one person, and even often when it's one person, they actually haven't yet picked what the goal is. And then you put more people in the mix, and now there's 3 or 4 different conflicting goals. And what do we actually mean by the thing we're trying to do? So there's that sort of meta alignment, kind of making sure that are we still allowed to say the word meta? Because this other stupid company has unfortunately abused it. I still like the word. I think it has a useful context, but I don't like that company so much. But anyway, so there's that sort of kind of in a different way, kind of looking at sort of setting goals and targets. And the other side is, I think quite correctly, as you say, very often people want to try to do something faster. And part of what we try to get people to see is that it's not about kind of pushing the A key faster to make the letter come out. It's actually about getting the right people or the right teams doing the right thing at the right time. And in most cases, you can actually work a hell of a lot less on an individual and on a team basis and produce substantially higher results. It's not about productivity at all. Although the outcomes will come out quicker and you might be able to produce more with less. It's getting rid of all of the wasted things that are sitting around unfinished, lying around on people's desks and in their inboxes, on their Trello boards and wherever else they're sitting, that have been waiting there for 18 plus months, as I often find in organizations. Huge amounts of energy went into something that we thought made sense 2 years ago. We're still building it. We're not sure. We weren't even that sure that it made sense or that it made that much sense at the start. And yet we're still busy doing it. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't know. Maybe if you guys see this kind of stuff in the context that you're working as well.
Yeah, I think that the 3 things that people are generally looking for is they want a balance between efficiency, effectiveness, and predictability. And, part of that, is time to market or reducing risk, or there might be other things they might say, but generally it's those 3 things, and they want something to help them with that. And I think to what you were saying before, we think efficiency is the answer to get the other 2, but generally we're already being way too efficient, and we're not effective or predictable because of that. Exactly what you're saying. You're starting a lot of stuff. You're keeping everybody very busy inside of your organization. And things are getting older and older because they just sit and wait in queues because we hurry up and wait.
Yeah, because that's the part of the challenge, and I think is that we're usually only capable of seeing the world from our own perspective, because we're literally looking with our own 2 eyes, and it's much harder to kind of zoom out and see the broader perspective of, well, the 3 of us work in a team together, and all 3 of us are super busy, but none of the things that we're all focusing on or that we're actually caring about as a whole group are getting done that fast, because we're just working on 6 different projects and passing things around and producing extra work. And so, you do need to get better at actually delivering in order to be able to achieve, you need an output in order to be able to have an outcome. But ultimately it's the outcome. And this one is interesting for me. Like you mentioned, the predictability, I think it is often a thing, but company like Tesla doesn't come about and invent the future by trying to be predictable. I mean, they need maybe on a supply chain level some predictability, but the ideas that they put in their cars are probably not predictable, at least to some extent. And it's an interesting topic to open up, is how do you balance this kind of capitalizing on new opportunities as they emerge versus trying to be predictable and efficient.
But I would say that they're predictably delivering something. We had Joe Justice on the podcast a few months ago, and he worked at Tesla for a while.
Sure.
And he was talking about how they do 3-hour sprints, basically, at Tesla, 12-hour days, 3-hour sprints. Every single sprint, you deliver something to done. And it's like, well, there's predictability in that they know every 3 hours, each of these teams are going to be delivering something that's valuable, and then they can use it, and hopefully they get some value from that, or more cars, more predictability on parts and timing, whatever the thing might be that they're trying to do.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a level of predictability. It's not like I know exactly where I'm going to be, 12 months from now. It's I know I'm going to have delivery and choices, and I have multiple choices. And because I have those choices, I can get feedback and then learn faster than everybody else. Right? That's the kind of predictability we're talking about.
I think that's exactly the kind of thing that I often like to unpack with others and try to get a sense of when you say predictability and efficiency, what do we actually mean by those things? Not because I want to debate semantics, but just my assumption about it and yours and somebody else's are going to be slightly overlapping, but not the same thing. And so how do we zoom in on, okay, well, when we say efficiency or predictability, let's be sure we're talking about the same thing and perhaps even put some sort of a descriptor or a number to it. Here's where we are right now. Something like that can be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, from just a Kanban standpoint, I really like just looking at service level expectations and what does that 85% look like, or 95, whatever number we want to look for. And then looking at that at multiple levels, I think can be really valuable to teams. Like from a flight level standpoint, like I just want to see whatever that we're measuring is, if it's features, epics, however we're looking at it in our organization. I want to see these things at a certain level being delivered. If we're talking our 85 is multiple years, that seems like a problem to me. Like, and that's where some organizations are, right? Like, for the most part.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing is a big part of it is being able to understand, and this is sort of where for me a lot of the systems thinking comes in, is that if you don't have some sense of the current dynamics of the system and the capabilities of the system, it's quite hard or quite unlikely that you will design a change or improvement that is going to have a positive effect. You end up changing stuff, but it's not necessarily the case that because you took out a problem, that whatever you replaced it with is naturally better. If you've ever gone to a very dodgy mechanic, you would know exactly how that works, is that you get a bunch of parts replaced, but a couple of years down the line, even more things are broken. And that's not necessarily what we mean or what we're wanting. So I think really taking the time to sort of start to get a sense of what actually is happening in the organization. Where are the challenges? What is it? Is it the teams not being fast enough? Is it somehow connections between the teams for communication? Is it the product doesn't perform well enough once we deliver it? Would more widgets or more units be better? And to what extent? Because it's a dynamic system. It changes. We tweak something and then the bottleneck moves and all of those kind of things that play a role. So, it's a fascinating space to work in.
So when you're thinking systems thinking, because that's really what flight levels are all about, right? Like we're looking at the whole system and how do we optimize for whatever that optimizing goal that we want, like we talked about before. It could be multiple different things depending on your organization. Do you find, this is what I find, and I'm just curious if you find the same thing. I find that a lot of times people are looking at secondary and tertiary goals. Like, well, we can't do this because then we got to share the code across or this technology across all these teams. And, that's going to be really inefficient to teach people all that stuff. We should really just have one team and have a queue backup so we can keep these people busy. Like that's kind of the logic I hear, or it's not safe for us to give people the access to this. Do you find the same type of things where it's like people are focusing on, and maybe for the CIA, it's okay, like risk and like security, like we're okay with that. But like for most product teams out there, that's not your optimizing goal. It's really learning and how do we get more to market to learn faster? And so that's going to be a constraint if you put that in place, like
totally.
Like that.
And I don't think it's super surprising because the vast majority of teams that I've seen don't have any kind of customer contact. And I don't mean that you have to talk exclusively and directly to your customer, but they don't necessarily even have any kind of customer metrics or even something as kind of vague or, put aside my opinions about NPS, but something that tells you do people like your product or do they not like your product? Do you even know that? I've done work with a couple of insurance companies and banks and stuff, and it's just you get incentivized because you deliver the thing on time, and then what happens after it's done? Nobody even knows what happened. Did the people who you built it for even try to use the feature? Did they even get it? We don't know. It's somewhere in the deployment pipeline, and maybe they got it, maybe they didn't. Maybe it's there, but somebody discovered it by mistake. Those kind of things. So. I totally see these kind of secondary or tertiary or even proxy metrics for things. We deliver in time, but I don't know what happened. So, and it's a balance. You can't focus too much on just the outcomes because you'll end up I think often just sort of theorizing and thinking about what problem are we solving. At some point, you actually have to then say, okay, we decide we're going to do this thing, and then you do it, and then you find out what happens at the end. But if you're tacking on your instrumentation or your metrics and measurement as an afterthought rather than something saying, well, can I sketch it on a piece? One of my favorite things, I don't know if you ever came across a guy by the name of Joel Spolsky. He wrote several books. Joel on Software was his blog for many years. He actually is one of the co-founders of the company that built Trello originally, if you know the app. They sold it off now to another organization. But anyway, he talked about this concept of a hallway usability test, which I really liked, which was quite simply write your idea down or sketch it on a piece of paper, build a very light mock-up, go out in the hallway and pick 3 people at random and show it to them. And if they don't get it, do another pass. And I think it's fantastic is we tend to build things quite often, and we make some very expensive version of a first version. And you could just show it to someone in the hallway and they could go, huh? And you go, okay, maybe I need to do another think of this thing. And that kind of thing.
What is the truth curve, Jeff, that I was thinking about as Cliff? Who did that?
Oh, I gotta look.
I'll put you on the spot. I know it's Josh Scheiden, and I can't remember the other guy's name.
Oh,
anyway, as Jeff is pulling up, because he's a wizard with that stuff, that immediately was what I was thinking about, Cliff, as you were talking about, is like doing the minimal amount of validation as you're going through the discovery process, right? And like that's where your MVPs start to play a part. And even MVPs are more like down that funnel, right? We've already done some initial validation. We've already done the paper prototype like you were just talking about, right?
Yeah.
And sorry, I know this is a little bit off. Well, it's related to what you were just saying, but it really just made me think about all that waste that we were talking about earlier, where it's like understanding the amount of effort that you're putting into something should be correlated with the amount of validation that you've done in the overall process of it. So, or in inverse correlation, I think is, so if we've done no validation, we should be doing no effort to actually building the thing.
Sure.
As we do more and more validation, then we putting more and more effort into actually building out the full implementation of whatever the solution is that we're going after.
Yeah. I think that totally makes sense. And trying to get some sort of a sense of like, are we at least like, I think the risk is that people end up in a space where you kind of have to prove your idea before you build it almost. And the reality is that almost no really great ideas or revolutionary ideas were provable in advance. I mean, Tesla is a prime example of this. Like, if you tried to tell people that Tesla would do what they did, and you were talking to a bunch of car executives, I mean, even today, probably, if you talk to people at BMW and Audi, they're going, nah, I'm not sure that Tesla's on the right direction, or resisting it for certain reasons. But that's the thing, is that you can't prove it in advance, but you can at least get some sort of a smell that like, yeah, we're going in the right general direction. Or is it actually usable and understandable, as opposed to like, market fit is separate from usability kind of thing, but just a simple case of like, if we did it like this, do people get what we mean? And you might find out something interesting as a result of that. So, yeah.
I don't know. I was going to say, like, I don't know that I would say Tesla didn't have a plan. Like, there is a model that they said, there's the master plan. Elon's like, we're going to build a really expensive car, and it's going to be fast. It's going to be sporty. And then we're going to use the money that we make, if we make from that, to build a little less expensive car, but still going to be pretty expensive for the general public. And then we're going to use the money from that to build the next one. Like, he kind of had a plan of how he was going to get there. And it was going to be different because it was going to, this is going to be a very performance car, not a, what we all think of as an electric car now, or what we used to. So I think he had a plan. I think, I don't remember all the phrasing of all the stuff, but he had a very detailed plan of like, this is how it's going to work. And then he'd done it on other companies or something similar. And so people are like, okay, I can buy in on that. Let's see you do it, give it a shot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just a couple more things, just what we were talking about before. So Jeff, you were talking about Jeff, Gotham, and then
Godhealth.
Yep. And then Josh Seiden, sorry.
Yeah.
And then the truth curve. And then the truth curve, that was that's Gift Constable.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's lots of stuff in there. I think they both talk about it. Josh and Jeff talk about it in their books too. They reference the truth curve multiple times, and they talk about their classes and stuff that they do.
So one of the other more tactical examples that I like to talk about was, and Jeff, I think you were part of this initiative a while ago. We were both at the same consulting group, and we were helping a big power tool company implement Bluetooth across their entire tool line. I mean, huge initiative. And I distinctly remember two things that we did early on in validation. Was the first thing was we were doing some user study groups, or I forget the proper term for it, but just going out and trying to understand their customer. And one of the first things that they were thinking about doing was building their own hardware piece that would interact with all of these devices. And so we send our UX wizard out there, they're interviewing, and one of the very first things he notices, all these people that are on a job site, they're all wearing gloves. None of them are going to use your touchscreen little application that's too small, that's going to fall and break on the job site, et cetera. And I can't fathom the amount of money that saved the organization right there from going down this path where we're going to custom build our own piece of hardware. It's going to have a touch interface, all this stupid shit. But the other thing, though, when we actually got to implementation, was we were the mobile team. So we were doing the iOS implementation, and we were coordinating with the hardware team, actually building the Bluetooth technology directly into the power tools. And I distinctly remember the end of sprint 1. So 2 weeks into this thing, our goal was to simply integrate. So we had a hardware, it's called a crimper. If you're not familiar, just it looks like a claw, pressures the shit out of something, stupid
Power
amount
lines,
of pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And so all the end of sprint 1 was integrating those two things. So the device did a crimp. We connected it to an iPhone, and we displayed a green or a red at the end of that, right? That was it. And, we had a lot of higher level people sit around and kind of that's it? That's all you're showing me? I'm yeah, but did you just notice the fact that we had a complete end-to-end validation, right? Within 2 weeks, we were able to validate that we can get something from a piece of hardware and display it on a device, right? Normally you don't get that for 6, 8, 12 months into a project. And if you don't, oh, surprise, you've got an integration project hiding at the end there, because now we built this silo up over here and we got to make it talk to this silo over here. And then we just iterated on top of that. But just, I like that. It's not exactly discovery, but it is that iterative approach of validating functionality earlier on, right? Getting that risk out of your system and then simply building on top of it.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly kind of the point. Other Jeff was talking about Tesla and them having a plan. And I think the point was, in that situation, they knew what the high risk factors were. If we can't get this thing right, and a first prototype of something is always going to be expensive, right? It's going to cost more than the thing will cost in reality. So why not go for the people who will pay a lot of money or have a lot of money to buy something like this and be a bit experimental in the first place? I think that plan, that was brilliant. Exactly like you were saying with this, testing the crimping device, it makes sense that you try to find the place where you actually can have some leverage, because if you're just experimenting and kind of doing a bunch of different things, but you've kind of validated all of the really easy stuff here on the side, as you said, you've got an integration project hiding in the background that's going to come and bite you in the ass in a few weeks later or a few months later. I think it's really fascinating when you get into the space, because a lot of people will talk about these things as if it's you always need a plan, or you never need a plan, or you always need to know this, or you never need to know that. It always, and I hate the answer, but it does depend. But it depends a little bit on what is the organization trying to achieve, and that for me is always the starting point with this kind of stuff. What is your actual, back to your first question about what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve here? Are we trying to make it easier to scale this stuff? Are we trying to reach 1 billion users or 200? Because it matters. It really does matter. And if we misunderstand the sort of circumstances that we have, I do this example where I say, if I hold up this phone, it doesn't work so well on video because you obviously can all see the same side. But if we were in an auditorium or something, I would see one side, you would see the other. We all know that it's an iPhone, but we see different parts of it. And this is a little bit of what Flight Devils is trying to do, but I think also in a sort of a getting customer feedback perspective, what you're trying to do is see the other sides of the problem. If actually building it at any scale is going to be a huge challenge, say like COVID vaccines, for example, maybe you need to kind of get out ahead of that because you're going to need some kind of manufacturing capability in advance. And so as a parallel thread, you're experimenting, can we build the thing at scale? While at the other side, you're trying to validate what the hell do we even build? And so knowing something about what are the challenges that you face is really, I think, a super important thing, and often very much misunderstood in this case, because I think most of us work in a space where we're just kind of given something to build rather than a problem to solve. And that for me is missing a huge trick for the organization, because you will probably get something built and you may even get it on time and in budget. But will it be useful? Like the biggest differentiator is completely an asymmetric payoff curve. Like, if you get it right, you've got the iPhone. If you get it wrong, you go out of business. And like, I mean, there's a lot of answers in between those two things, but the further up that curve you can go, that's where the high-end benefits and payoffs are. And so we should be looking a little bit at least at this, not just, at that, but also can we deliver it? I think those are sort of two sides of the same coin, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like what you said there about like different threads. That's how I talk about it too, is like independent work streams that, we might be after a similar goal, or, like you're talking, like, how do we produce the vaccine, and what is the vaccine that we're actually going to do? So we might work on two different work streams at the time. As long as they're independent, that's okay. When you have these conflicts and these dependencies between different work streams, you slow everybody down, and you're slowing the whole system down. And we tend to focus on keeping all these people busy as different work streams and moving around so much that you can never really get to anything done. And I think that whole systems thinking approach of like, how do I make things more independent as a whole work stream, is something that a lot of organizations could look at, instead of trying to say, let's get really good at the thing that we do, the writing in this type of API or using this type of coding language or whatever the thing might be. Let's focus on how do we get this independent work stream to deliver whatever, more effective solutions, more predictability. Like, what is the thing that we want there?
Yeah. And I think it's sort of, to unpack a little bit of the nuance inside there, is that one of the challenges with like chasing inefficiency is that if you chase efficiency, at least, what it usually leads you to do is remove things that are seen as somewhat wasteful. But when you're in a discovery and exploration kind of stage, just trying to find something new or something to improve, there will be waste. There has to be, because you like if you only pick the safe options, which is usually what people will do in a low risk kind of that sort of environment. You pick the safe options. It means you're probably picking things that are not new and novel, and so they won't sort of change your company drastically as a result, or change your product performance as a result. But it means that, the other way around, you might have some ratio of failure, and you have to be able to absorb that. But you don't want to bet the company and take a wild risk on every bet. So knowing when to take a super risky bet, or when to kind of have some kind of, I don't know, maybe a budget limit or whatever on how much money would you spend before you pull the plug on something. Like, you need to have some sort of control between these. So don't gamble everything, but also don't never take a risk either, because you'll end up stuck in both of those two situations if you sort of overplay one hand, I think, is kind of the way I would think about it.
Yeah, being okay with making decisions with incomplete information, but making them faster is better than doing a bunch of analysis and trying to say, yep, we're guaranteed this is going to be the right decision, but we've now spent way more money to get to that last, 10 or 20% of information that we feel comfortable with. So I think a lot of organizations can make decisions just with less information and do a little less analysis and take a step back. But that means I'm not saying don't do anything, but like there's better ways to do some validation there, and, maybe make a decision instead of with like 95% of the information, make it with 70 or 75,
Sure.
And if we're wrong more frequently, that's okay. We've the amount of money we were to spend to get that last 20%, we've reinvested that in, and we've found out sooner. Now we can make a pivot, or decide not to spend that money or do something else.
Yeah. There's a fantastic book I read a couple of years ago called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. I don't know if you've heard of this book.
Yeah, it's a good book.
And one of the things that she kind of explores, I'm paraphrasing quite a bit here, but this idea that somehow playing more hands of poker will make you a better poker player. And I think to some level that might have some element of truth to it, that, you're more likely, like you have more opportunities to learn at least. But the actual learning that you take from each hand that you play, I think, is a really fascinating one. And the number of times that I've seen organizations and individuals literally just doing the same thing again and again and again and going, yeah, like we're a learning organization. You're like, what did you learn from the last, sprint increment, or from your last delivery or your last release cycle? We learned that we have another 100,000 things in the backlog. That's the only thing that we seem to learn sometimes. And that's not necessarily making the situation any better. And granted, you have to balance a little bit. Like, you can't spend all your time improving and no time actually delivering. But if you're not learning, you're missing out on those opportunities. So the benefit of playing more hands doesn't turn into anything if you still only learn one thing from 300,000 hands. So yeah, I love this thing of like exploring sort of the nuance of like, well, where are we in this mix? Like, do we need more learning or do we need more speed? And it could be a little bit of both, but which one are we going to pick right now? Or how do we choose?
It depends on your product though, and the maturity and where it's at. Like if we're early on, maybe we do just need to try a bunch of stuff. Like if we're doing a new greenfield product, like I would say you want lots of experiments, and we just need to see what's interesting and try some stuff. I'm just thought of this, reminded of this story that Daniel Vacante and Pradeep put out. It was a blog about don't be a Ditka, but they're not. I don't think they're as avid football fans as I am. So I think I can add a little more color here to it to our listeners. But so it was the 1999 draft, and the New Orleans Saints decided that they're the football team, American football team, and every team gets 7 picks to start the year, and then there's different things that happen. They trade them away. You can lose players, and sometimes you get a pick for things that happen. And the coach wanted to move from the 5th overall pick he was at the 12th pick to about the 5th overall pick. So he wanted to move up 7 picks, and he traded all his picks for that year, 7 picks, and then his number 1 pick and his third pick for the next year to get that one player, Ricky Williams. He thought he was going to be the best player of all time. He thought he was the next Walter Payton or Barry Sanders or something like that. Well, he was a good player, but he wasn't phenomenal, right? And the amount of players they missed out on there was crazy, only to move up that many picks. Meanwhile, the next year later, this little known guy from Michigan gets picked at 199th. Tom Brady ends up being the greatest player of all time, pretty much. And so it's like 199 people had chances to get this player. And if we knew what we knew, they would have picked him all before that. Anybody would have. Even if you had a quarterback, you would have picked him. And they didn't. And so we don't know these things in product development. It's very similar to this. Like there's a lot more unknowns and knowns, but if I have a lot more picks, I have a better chance of, picking something that's going to work out and finding some people that are going to make the team or take that next jump. And same thing in products. I think like if you run a lot of experiments and you're looking at the data and you measure against it, you have an opportunity to make a better decision. Will you make it every time? No, but you're creating an environment of learning, and you start creating a habit of learning. Yep. And it's more likely to happen. Now we've increased our odds and our predictability of success because we've increased the number of experiments running and the amount of learning that can happen,
Yeah. And I think this is something like in a flight levels context, what I often try to, because I spend a lot of time working with sort of the mid to senior executives within an organization, and trying to kind of unpack that a little bit and say, okay, well, in this situation, what is kind of the portfolio of different bets that we are placing in this setting? So it might not be that every organization needs to be highly predictable. Some do, some don't, but there are maybe certain types of work that need high level of predictability. So you want a very fast response time on customer queries in a call center, for example. People like to have their problems resolved, but maybe when you're doing something like building those grand new features that could ship with this year's release or next year's release of the iPhone, it doesn't matter so much whether it's predictable or not. It's more a case of like, there's a cutoff point, and beyond a certain point, it's going to go the following year. And so you need to make that decision. And so having a little bit of those tools to play with to say, well, we're going to spend some time on super risky things. We're going to spend some time on like improving the existing stuff. And then we're going to spend a bunch of time on just running the existing business as it stands. And how do we split our capacity and capability across that? Where do we need to be making improvements? Is it actually on the innovation stuff, or is it on the efficiency side? And maybe it's a little bit of a spread across both, but it's certainly not like you wouldn't want a situation where one of those was getting in way of the other unless you had intentionally chosen that to be the case. But the typical situation that I see a lot of organizations in is that everybody's kind of fighting for their own piece of the pie, not because there's some sort of malicious intent. It's just because I don't know that you have a different goal, and each of you has a different goal, and I'm telling this team this is the most important thing, and so are both of you. And the team is sitting there going, well, we can flip a coin, or we can decide based on other information, which is often some combination of who pays my salary, who do I like the most, or which one will create the most pain if we don't do it. And those three things tend to not correlate with which one is the best idea. And so finding some way to try to overcome a little bit of that tendency and, just use the real information that's actually available rather than just, it gets a little bit messy otherwise, I think. So, yeah.
How do flight levels help with that? Help us see the goals across different teams, and when somebody's maybe working towards a different optimizing goal, because a lot of times people might think, that team's so hard to work with, but really, like, the initiative they've been set on, and maybe what they're getting paid for or something, there's some compensation there where this is what they've been told to do, and that's why they're working a certain way, right? There's something else going on. So how does flight levels help reveal maybe that in a system?
Yeah. So one of the things we try to do is identify something that looks a little bit like a value stream or a set of teams that work together to deliver some value. So the scenario would be, say, the three of us work on three different teams, or maybe we're in that sort of a context. And so what we do is we say, okay, let's get the three of us together to build a visualization at a higher level that designs or captures the different aspects of what we're working on. So it might be that we're shipping a set of common projects or some sort of initiatives. It might be that we deal with certain features within a product set, whatever the work is, but there's usually something that kind of connects us together. So sort of the layer above the task that we do. And then we try to prioritize those things. And what I usually say to folks is that one of the things that I really liked that we used at Spotify was this heuristic of saying, don't let number 3 block number 1, which is a little bit of sort of shorthand for prioritization. It's not saying that you have to always work on number 1, but if number 1 is actually number 1, it should be that you don't let number 3 consume the capacity that could help with number 1. So simple scenario, I need one of you to help me, and you're working on number 1. I should know not to ask you to come and help me. So it just saves that time and that interruption for both of us. But similarly, if you need my help and I'm working on number 3, I should totally expect that I should switch focus and come and help within some reasonable level of expectation. And so the goal is not to get everybody to do perfectly and 100% always the right answer, but at least to make it visible. Like when we're talking about prioritization, are we talking about this thing or this one? Which one? And if we have different answers, we're going to create a suboptimal situation. But the closer we can get to prioritizing the same thing consistently, the more likely it is that that one thing will actually move faster through the system. And so it's not about working fast at any step of the process. It's simply about reducing, the cost and the consequence of the handoffs and the wait times in between. So that a little bit like the airport, you get a fast track through. And yes, that does mean that it makes it slower for everything else, but that's the point. You get to pick which one gets the fast track, and that's the cool part. But you can't make everything the fast track, otherwise it's no longer a fast track. That's just the reality.
I would say, though, like what I've found is if you really focus on your WIP limits and your work item age across your system, not just at the team level, that you can get almost everything to work like an expedite now, like a number 1. It just, you have to be disciplined in being okay with things. Some people are just not going to be very busy. And I would say, good, go figure out a way to help that team. Like, we're only going to work on so many things. And that's a really hard thing for a lot of organizations to do, because it's like, I'm paying that payroll. Like, I want them to do something. And it's like, but if they start something, then they need to meet with somebody else who's doing the thing that you really think is the most important. And that thing slows down. But and if we're thinking of Andy Duke's thinking in bets, like, this is our big bet right here. And now we're pulling that off and we're delaying that learning on that big bet. So, it actually hurts you more sometimes to be starting stuff, even though it doesn't feel that way. It sounds very inefficient.
Exactly.
But sometimes you're okay. It's inefficiency is going to lead to better effectiveness and more predictability. Right. So.
And I think that's exactly the thing that, and I don't think that flight levels is the only way to solve this kind of challenge. But what it's giving people when we do flight levels in the organization, and specifically at when you build a coordination system, It's giving folks a place to go and look at the things that they are actually prioritizing rather than worrying about the details in the team. And so if you can see the work flowing at the higher level, and that should, for most cases, be your focus, you only end up troubleshooting kind of in the details when it's actually impeding the flow of something that is really high on the priority list. Instead of spending your time, where is this project? Where is that project? You can actually know that and spend your time as a leader or a manager accordingly. And the other part of it is that it starts to give everybody in the organization a lot more information. There's a wonderful quote from Don Reinertsen. He says, if you want to decentralize decision-making, you need to decentralize not only the authority to make the decisions, but the information that's necessary to make good decisions. And I think this is often what we do when you build a flight level 2 system specifically, is that you give people some information that is otherwise remaining hidden inside the manager or the other team's heads. And so now we're all looking at something that is a little bit more like the same picture. And so when I pick what to work on next, it's quite likely that you would also have picked the same thing. And I can make a sort of a collective decision that benefits all of us rather than just in the absence of that information. And so when the manager shows up with a brand new idea and says, oh, well, I want to do this new project, the question is not who's available. The question is, where does it go in the priority? And so you can go and put it on your system and say, okay, it's in the queue somewhere, and we will start it when we have capacity. And so you're actually doing pull at level 2 and level 3, not just in the teams, which is profoundly different to how most organizations do things. It's much more of I had an idea, someone's available, so we've started some work. How do we deal with the rest of it? We haven't figured that out yet. And yeah, that's probably not the worst situation if that person is not affecting any of the other projects. But if they happen to be your Tom Brady or the person who is kind of the key player in several other projects, you're going to have some challenges. Yeah.
I think one thing I want to just key in on that you said, it's because some people might have hear that differently, like, oh, so everybody makes the decision all the time, like we're looking for consensus. And I don't think that's what you're saying at all, right? Like you're saying multiple people can make the decision, and because we have the flight levels and the transparency, we understand the priority, whoever needs to make the decision at that moment can make the right decision. Because right now what happens probably in the organization is, like you said, people are making decisions, but it's by whoever's yelling the loudest, whoever is hardest to deal with, whatever the situation might be. There's a lot of emotional decisions being made instead of strategic decisions being made.
Yeah. Or worse, just I will ignore it and hope it goes away, and then it's just sitting around waiting. Which, I mean, that's okay if that's actually an intentional choice, but when it's just a sort of a default of like, well, it's safer for me not to say anything, that's a challenge. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think the other piece of this is just to kind of look at it from another angle as well, is also trying to think about what type of information do people need to make decisions. Because I think something that I found quite often at Spotify was there was almost an oversharing of information. And the problem is then you're kind of drowning in information, and you've got to, like, it's quite, I mean, I think it's quite a full-time role to spend time thinking about the strategy and the direction of the company. It's not something you can do kind of while also being a software developer. The CEO will have more time to think about strategy than you will. That's quite simple. And so it's not that their perspective is the only perspective that should be considered. But if you can try to say, well, as the software developer, they need some parts of this information. Can I make the bits that are relevant to the projects that they work on, or the teams that they interact with, or the customers that they serve, or the specific technologies that they are reliant on, make them aware of those things and give them access to that information, rather than trying to fill their heads with everything that I know. And so it helps you to say something like, well, you're only working on those 2 projects, so I don't need to communicate to you about the other 17 because you don't have anything to do with them. And you see this often with teams when they start to do something like scaled Agile, or they're doing Scrum at scale, or these sort of things. And I don't say it to bash the methodologies or anything. It's just that if you don't think about which teams are present in what stand-ups, what communication loops, it ends up that I'm sitting there listening to the 2 of you talking about projects that I've never, like, I have no way to influence. And that's not a helpful use of my time. And if you scale that too much, you end up just putting more and more communication overhead into the organization without making anything actually go faster. Mm-hmm. And so what we try to do is design a way that says, and we spend a lot of time talking about the Agile interactions, as we call them in flight levels. How do we get the right people talking to the right people at the right time? not everybody talking to everybody all the time, because it's counterproductive. I don't have enough brainwaves or cognitive ability, cognitive load at least, available to be able to listen to every possible story that the organization has to tell me. So let's pick the right ones.
As you were, excuse me, as you were talking about that, not directly related, but something you had mentioned about over communication. And one of the things, so we recently got a new president, and he comes from the Amazon space. And one of the things that he's bringing with him and trying to change for our culture, we were a very PowerPoint-driven culture. Not necessarily knocking PowerPoint; it's a tool, and it generally has it's a good tool for the right job. I think we were overusing it a little bit, and so now what we've shifted to doing is, let's say we've got a feature idea and we want to put it out there. And typically what we would come into a meeting, have the CEO in the room and other product managers, et cetera, and step through a PowerPoint deck, pitch the idea, et cetera. And now what we're doing is creating that almost like a press release. It's not a press release. We have no standard as far as what we've got to do, but it's just putting the opportunity to have all of your thoughts down on a single piece of paper. And then we jump into the meeting and everybody turns the cameras off, turns their mics off, and you just go read the document. That's how you start out the meeting. Depending on the size of that document, maybe it's just a 5-minute read, maybe it's a 30-minute read. But everybody is stepping through the documents. They throw their questions in there in real time. They're able to individually assimilate all of this information. Then we come out of it. Then we have a discussion. And it's not like, hey, we got to step through every one of these questions. It's like, who believes they have a critical question that needs to be answered about this to make a decision moving forward, or something to that effect, almost like a powerful question, but it really gives the prioritization on the person who put the question in there. Like, yeah, I really do think this is important. We should talk about it. And I just kind of want to throw out, when, again, thinking about your over communication, I found that super valuable, just having the opportunity to really think through these things. And then in particular at the end, every document, one of the templates or the standardizations that we're making is it has to have an FAQ. It has to have an appendix at the end. And it really makes you think about, okay, well, what are those questions that people are likely going to ask? Well, fuck it. Why don't I just go ahead and put the question and the answer right in the document so they don't even have to answer that question? Oh, I missed this area of the document. I might want to flesh this out a little bit more because it's not conveying enough information. And not that over documentation is a good thing, and I promise I'll end this rant in just a second. But what it really forces you to think through those common questions, think through holistically the idea that you're putting out there, and then you just have this nice standalone artifact that does stand on its own. It's not this deck where it needed you to lead the interaction and guide everybody through it. And it allows everybody to assimilate that information in a slightly different way. And then cool, just go and attach it to the Jira item or whatever your tool of choice is. And now you've got, the concept document directly attached to the item before you're even started with it.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. I've been using that Amazon style press release thing for a little while, and I've been using it again recently in the last couple of months, again because we've been shipping some stuff inside the academy, and I love it, and for pretty much all the reasons that you mentioned. That it's something you can take away and you can read. It doesn't take as long as the presentation. Thinking through and writing the FAQ forces you to think about the perspective of the people reading the document. I think it's fantastic. And yeah, I mean, what we often do internally is that I'll just write it up in like a Google Doc and then send it out to everybody and they can comment on it. And it's like, I mean, you can get comments of everything from there's a typo and a punctuation error to like, this sentence doesn't make sense. Can you explain what you mean by this? Or even a proposal of like, just make this quick edit to, I don't know, this doesn't sound like a good idea. And maybe we talk about like why, or, what's the business case behind it, that kind of a thing. I think we not even over communicate. It's just like the amount of information that needs to be necessary to start a project inside most organizations is absurd to me. And part of the challenge, I think, is that very often what happens is that if it becomes expensive to start a project, what it means is that the project itself needs to be very expensive, like in terms of the outcome, like it needs to have a high return. And the best way to do that usually is to throw a ton of stuff inside it. And so you get these ginormous, like sort of creaking along kind of projects that are starting to try to solve all the world's problems, instead of this tiny little thing that would take, a team 2 months to do, and it would make us millions. And so I think that this kind of an approach is really, really quite helpful, because you could write a short press release, and maybe even as I've seen in some product organizations doing, saying, well, what do we need to run a first kind of validation cycle on this? Oh, we need one team for 3 weeks, or 4 teams for a quarter. Okay, cool. Now we've got some kind of, we can weigh the capacity and say, given the capacity we have available, we would invest in the following things. And that connects a little bit nicely back to what I was saying about the different sort of investment portfolios. Some of these are super risky, and so we would visualize them on the level 2 system as different, maybe a color or like a different swim lane or something. And then you have other things that are like, these are just kind of standard run the business stuff that we have to do. We're pretty certain that the outcome will be what we think it is. It's not massively risky, but it's also not massively high return. And we want to just keep ticking through these things because that's our bread and butter, and that's how we make money. And another piece of nuance with this is that I think often you get this kind of disconnect in the organization. So the reality is that 90% of your money probably comes from things that you do right now, rather than the next thing that you're going to ship, right? And of course, there are nuances, and there's scenarios where that isn't the thing. But the reality is that we tend to focus a lot of our energy from the leadership space on shipping the next new feature, at least in technology companies, and not so much on running the current business. And so the challenge is that you actually get slower and worse at delivering your current project, which to me is an enormous risk, right? People come to you because of the thing you currently do. And if you're getting worse and worse and worse at it, somebody else can come and eat your lunch, and you're going to lose out. And so taking some kind of a strategic and slightly balanced approach, saying, okay, 20% on new projects and features, 10% on super risky moonshots, and then the other 70%, like a lot of banks would do, on just running the existing organization. That makes sense. And then we can also ask questions of saying, well, we know that in the future, those revenue streams might die, or they're going to need to be under certain cost pressures because, efficiencies, AI, automation, whatever. So we need to try to drive down the costs of certain things so we can shift our focus to other places, and that sort of a thing. So it's a much more kind of strategic approach than just a delivery or a theorizing about the outcome approach. So yeah, I think it's lots of interesting conversations to have around these topics, but it's important stuff.
I think you could use those briefs, like you were saying, though, Jeff, and you could almost like put that at a flight level and do some prioritization there. So, like, are we prioritizing the decisions that we need to make? Because let's just say you're Amazon. Like, how many meetings can Jeff Bezos really be in? Like, what decisions does he really need to make? How many are we delegating? Like, there's probably some that are way more important than others, and having the brief probably gives you enough information to say, yeah, that's the top. This is not that important. Like, let's push that off to someone else. So I almost wonder, like, is there an opportunity there to like increase the flow of your decision making through your organization with using the briefs?
And I think specifically when you start to put something like the capacity piece in it, you can look at something. So this was quite common within a Spotify context, for example. Within a certain context, if you wanted to spend, say, like a quarter or a year of time, then that needs to be prioritized at a certain level. If you want to spend a week or two, the team can just make that decision. And if you want to spend, something within the quarterly bound, then the tribe leadership and the immediate departmental leadership can make that decision. And of course, there can be exceptions where you still, ask for input from higher up, but that you've got you've got 10 team weeks to play with over the course of your quarter. You can allocate however you want. The rest is reserved for project work that will be prioritized somewhere else. And so you can distribute it at your own team. You don't need the senior leadership weighing in on, or Jeff Bezos to weigh in on everything that a team does. Like, quite frankly, it just doesn't scale if you do it that way. And so kind of like Don Reinertsen says, giving people sort of some constraints or some information that would help them to make better decisions, I think is a great way to kind of decouple some of that stuff, because it makes it a lot faster in many cases.
Yeah, having those guardrails and not spending all the time figuring all that stuff out, but being willing to do the small things and like constantly learning, I think that's a really important thing to put in place too for organizations.
Yeah, super important. Yeah, I think it's fascinating because one of my favorite examples inside Spotify was this feature called Discover Weekly, which I think a lot of people now know. But that started as a Hack Week project with 2 people working on it. And it actually surprisingly took them quite a long time to convince the rest of the company that it was a good idea to ship. There were a few people who were, quite senior in the organization who were quite skeptical of the idea for a variety of different reasons. And I mean, to their credit, it's now live, and those people, did change their mind, and it's now gone live. But the fact that something like Hack Week existed meant that somebody could take a week. And I think the initial prototypes were built in a few days. And yeah, we found something here. We think this is super interesting. What do you think? And when it did get released, the challenges were not like trying to build the actual feature, but more, can you scale it out to 100 million users? Because, the algorithm for recommending is not necessarily the challenge. It's the compute to do it, and certain nuances of accuracy, because what works for you and for me might be helpful. But then what about people in different countries or different languages, that kind of thing? How does that work? Are there sort of edge cases and stuff? So simple ways to test a small idea, see what works, and then when you're onto something, then bet big. But don't go all in on a hand that's super, super risky unless you're completely backed into a corner and you have no options. And even then, I'm not sure that that's necessarily a good strategy. So hope is not a strategy, I believe, is the one that I heard.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good quote.
Yeah.
So I know we're past our time box here a little bit, Cliff. So at this time, I just want to ask: is there anything you want to plug or promote to our listeners before we wrap up the podcast?
Sure. I would say if you're curious about some of the stuff with flight levels that I've talked about, 2 best ways to find out about this. One is to go to our website, flightlevels.io, and have a look around. Specifically, there is a simple self-paced course. It's entirely online. You can start basically as soon as you're signed up. It is not particularly expensive either. The introduction to flight levels, just have a look. And the other way is, if you're curious to find out something else or you have a specific question, hit me up on LinkedIn. I love to chat to people. It's super interesting to hear what people are doing with stuff, what challenges they face that maybe connect to the topics that we're talking about. I'd love to hear what you thought about. Maybe you want to discuss something or add a piece of nuance to what I said or something along those lines. Would be super interesting to chat. So reach out.
Thank you for listening to the Agile Wire. We are consistently inspecting and adapting ourselves. We would appreciate feedback at feedback@theagilewire.com or on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play Store. See you next time.